Don't you wish that your weekend was longer than just 2 days? Well, if so, then you're in luck, because here on Rippin' Common Sense Radio, our weekend begins on Wednesday. Yes, you heard that right. Our weekend kicks off every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central, with Darkwolf's Den, starring yours truly, Jerry the Dark Wolf. But that's where the fun has only just begun. Make sure you come back every Thursday through Sunday at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central, for the Rippin' Rabbit Hole live show, starring AJ the Rippin' Rabbit. He dives into the archives of vocal legend Art Bell and brings those stories up to date. So make sure that you spend your extended weekends with the animals of radio, Jerry the Dark Wolf and AJ the Rippin' Rabbit, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central, every Wednesday through Sunday, right here on Rippin' Common Sense Radio.
Rippin' Rabbit Hole is a community-driven radio. At times the community comments may reveal prejudices and other beliefs that we or our sponsors do not condone. Views or opinions expressed by the community, callers, or guests are those of the individual speaking and do not represent the views or opinions of this site. Rippin' Common Sense content is intended for mature audiences only. Enjoy.
This is Cynthia Sue Larson with Reality Shifters and the International Mandela Effect Conference, and you're now listening to DarkWolf's Den Show on Rippin' Common Sense Radio.
Now the ultimate power in the universe.
This is your man Meta, aka Propagate This Light, and you're now listening to DarkWolf's Den.
Are ghosts real?
We had 1,000 hours of continuous communication with the spirit world.
Does time travel actually exist?
The laws of physics seem to be compatible with time machines.
You know, sometimes I wonder about reincarnation. Don't you?
A 4-year-old boy in Adelaide, Australia, has told his parents that he used to be Britain's Princess Diana.
What would happen if the world found out that aliens were real?
I didn't say disclosure would be easy, but what is the alternative?
To establish a space force as the 6th branch of the armed forces.
We have so many questions and yet so little time, so to have you here, the pleasure is all mine.
Coming to you from a secret mountain cave, hidden deep within the Idaho wilderness, this is the DarkWolf's Den Show. Now, here is your host, Jerry Hicks.
That's right, I am Jerry Hicks, and welcome back to another episode of the DarkWolf's Den Show. I will be your host for this evening, so whether you're on the edge of reality, the edge of the galaxy, or the edge of your seat, I'm glad you chose us to be right there with you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is Spooktober 29th, 2020, and the last episode for the Spooktober episodes. And I hope everybody has enjoyed this month. But not all episodes have to be scary, as AJ said the other day. Tonight is going to be a fun episode, a variety episode, if you will. Something a little different than we normally do here. We're not going to have a single topic that we're going to cover. The single topic is going to be Halloween. I hope everybody's enjoyed DarkWolf's hosting the last couple of weeks, and he's done a great job with that gruff voice of his. But tonight I am back in full force, and we're ready to have some fun. Ain't that right, ladies and gentlemen? That's right. So, without any further ado, let's get this party started. But first, today in history. To me, it is always fascinating when the fact of the day lines up with the show topic. And even though this is a variety show topic tonight, it is a Halloween show, and this is probably the most fitting I've found all month long. Check this out, guys. In 1390, on this day, was the first trial for witchcraft in Paris. That's right. The first time an accused witch was taken to trial in Paris, which would evidently end in the person being burnt at the stake. The first accused witch also to be burnt at the stake. And that trial began on this day in 1390. And that is today's Today in History. And of course, I always find it so fascinating when the topic rolls right into what we're talking about. And tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about Halloween. All of the fun stuff that has to do with Halloween. And when it comes to Halloween, you know, for a lot of us, it's really nostalgic, right? It's all about our childhood. All the memories we made, dressing up, running around as kids and teenagers, and for some of us, a couple years ago. But anyway, that's another story. Anyway, the point is, we have that nostalgia from being a kid, and that's kind of what I wanted to touch back on tonight. That nostalgia of Halloween. That fun side, that party side, that, we don't always get to enjoy. So we've spent a whole month being scary and creepy and bringing out all these dark topics. Now it's time to spin them around and have some fun. And of course, our Today in History was the first witch trials in Paris. And when I think of witches, I originally think of Macbeth. That's right, the old Shakespeare Macbeth. Do you guys remember the witches in that?
By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes.
How now, you secret black and midnight hags? What is to do?
A deed without your name.
Togas under cold stones, days and nights at 31.
Sweltered venom, sleeping got, boil thou first in the charmed pot.
Eye of newt, toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog.
Adder's fork and blind worm sting, lizard's leg and owlet's wing.
Nose of turpin, Tartar's lips, severed in the moon's eclipse.
Fillet of a penny snake, in the cauldron boil and bake.
Liver of blaspheming dew, gall of goat and slips of yew.
And of course, in this scene, he goes on to chug this liquid brew that they've just stirred up in the cauldron. And I gotta say, I don't know if I would drink something with all those ingredients in it. But fair enough, he knew what he was getting into, right? He had better knowledge of his drink than we usually get from our FDA, right? He heard him announce what they were putting in there as they did it. But of course, that is from Macbeth and William Shakespeare, a classic writer. And speaking of classical writers, when it comes to Halloween, and when I think of spooky writers, of course, I think of Edgar Allan Poe. And Poe is known for a couple dark or macabre ideas and poems and short stories, a couple of which we're going to hear tonight. And of course, you can't talk about Poe without starting out with Poe's most famous of Halloween poems.
The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Read for you by Tomás Costal. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis an visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door, only this, and nothing more." Distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember brought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books a seas of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here, forevermore. And the silken, sad, and sudden rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you." Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into the darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, Surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flatter in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mine of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marvelled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther then he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends had flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master whom unmerciful disaster followed fast till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of never, nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking I betook myself to linking fancy and to fancy thinking, what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease, reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated over, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating over she shall press, nevermore. Then, methought, the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget his lost Lenore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophets tell if bird or devil, whether tempest sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is the balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door, quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight overstreaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
And that is, of course, a reading of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Something I remember reading in high school literature class, right? And that's kind of what this show's about tonight, is that throwback to back when we were kids, when Halloween really had a magic to it. When you would run around and have all that energy and all the fun and just being around everybody. And it's just that feeling, that holiday feeling you would get from hearing the music and just being around all the different Halloween festivities and decoration. And this party, or this show, is going to be no different. And I found just now a song that I used to sing as a kid in elementary school right around Halloween times. Remember, they would only pull those certain songs out right around this time. Well, I found one that I'd forgotten about until just now. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to share that with you guys. And maybe you guys remember this too as a kid. At least maybe some of you do. It's called Skin and Bones.
There wasn't a woman on Skin and Bones. She lived down by the old graveyard. One night she thought she'd take a walk. She walked down by the old graveyard. She saw the bones a laying around. She went to the closet to get a broom. She opened the door and
You guys remember that song? Maybe some of you. There were actually some hand movements that went with that. I don't remember them now. Goodness, I was so young then, but I do remember there were hand movements. There were all kind of little fun stuff about that song. So that was a really fun one that we used to do in music class as a kid around this Halloween fall season. And I really enjoy this season. I do, because it's just so much fun. There's so much magic that builds up at this time of year. This is just a very magical season. Things seem to come to life, right? Like jack-o'-lanterns. And we'll get into the history of jack-o'-lanterns here in a little bit as we talk about the history of Halloween and a couple of facts about Halloween itself. But before we get to that, I got one more song from my childhood, my Halloween childhood, if you will, that you guys might remember about the jack-o'-lantern.
5 little pumpkins sitting on a gate. The first one said, "Oh my, it's getting late." The second one said, "There are witches in the air." The third one said, "But we don't care." The fourth one said, "Let's run and run and run." The fifth one said, "We're ready for some fun." Then ooh went the wind and out went the light, and the 5 little pumpkins rolled out of sight.
And once again, that's yet another fun little nostalgic song from our childhood. At least some of us may remember it anyway. I know I remember in elementary school we used to sing that. And it really just brings back that magic, right? That magic of Halloween. That scary, eerie, but fun feeling, right? the ability to run around in a costume and a mask and nobody knows who anyone else is, and you can collect candy and be anonymous, at least for a couple minutes, right? If you don't have a partner running beside you like a sister or something, but besides that, you can pretty well be anonymous in your mask. And that's always so much fun. And there's just this certain magic, once again, I just keep bringing it up, and I know I keep bringing it up, but it is, around this season, you can feel it growing, right? And there's a spooky magic, once again, to Halloween. And that's really expressed in our next story. Another really popular Halloween story, and another one that I remember from literature class, and I'm going to let this play in its entirety, and I'm not going to jump in and edit any part or jump in and give my commentary. Ladies and gentlemen, in its entirety, I present to you W.W. Jacobs' story, The Monkey's Paw.
The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs, recording by Chris Coffey. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlour of Lakesnam Villa the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said the father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathway's a bog and the road's a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses on the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged too loudly and heavy footsteps came towards the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said "tut-tut" and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall burly man, beady of eyes and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The Sergeant Major shook hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of strange scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange people. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him." "He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look round a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day, about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw," said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the Sergeant Major offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. "To look at," said the Sergeant Major, fumbling in his pocket, "it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the Sergeant Major. "A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that Middle Ages want to regard presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the Sergeant Major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" inquired the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes, yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the 3rd was for death. That's how I got the paw." His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. "If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. "I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterwards." "If you could have another 3 wishes," said the old man, eyeing him keenly, "would you have them?" "I don't know," said the other. "I don't know." He took the paw, and dangling it between his front finger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier solemnly. "If you don't want it, Morris," said the old man, "give it to me." "I won't," said his friend doggedly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man." The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you do it?" he inquired. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the Sergeant Major. "But I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like the Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. "Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the Sergeant Major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterwards the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second instalment of the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us," said Herbert as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, "we shan't make much out of it." "Did you give him anything for it, father?" inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. "A trifle," he said, colouring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away." "Likely," said Herbert with pretended horror. "Why, we're going to be rich, and famous, and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked." He darted around the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact," he said slowly. "It seems to me I've got all I want." "If you only cleared the house you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with his hands on his shoulder. "Well, wish for £200 then. That'll just do it." His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. "I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran towards him. "It moved," he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table, "and I bet I never shall." "It must have been your fancy, father," said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. "Never mind, though, there's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same." They sat down by the fire again, while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. "I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, as he bade them good night, "and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains." In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, Herbert laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room, which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense!" How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, father? Might drop on his head from the sky, said the frivolous Herbert. Mara said that things happened so naturally, said his father, that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence. Well, don't break into the money before I come back, said Herbert, as he rose from the table. I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you. His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. All of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits, when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill. Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home, she said as they sat at dinner. I dare say, said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer, but for all that the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to. You thought it did, said the old lady soothingly. I say it did, replied the other. There was no thought about it. I had just... What's the matter? His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed, and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White, at the same moment, placed her hands behind her, and hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed furtively at Mrs. White, and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room, and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. I was called to ask, he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. I come from Ma and Megan's. The old lady started. Is anything the matter? She asked breathlessly. Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it? Her husband interposed. There, mother, he said hastily. Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir. And he eyed the other wistfully. I'm sorry, begged the visitor. Is he hurt? Demanded the mother. The visitor bowed in assent. Badly hurt, he said quietly, but he is not in any pain. Oh, thank God, said the old woman, clasping her hands. Thank God for that, She broke off suddenly, as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. He was caught in the machinery, said the visitor at length, in a low voice. Caught in the machinery, repeated Mr. White, in a dazed fashion. Yes. He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. He was the only one left to us, he said, turning gently to the visitor. It is hard. The other coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the window. The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss, he said, without looking around. I beg that you will understand I am only their servant, and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action. I was to say that Ma and Megan's disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the word, how much? £200 was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped a senseless heap to the floor. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead, and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation, as though of something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The monkey's paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room towards him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it." "It's in the parlour on the bracket," he replied, marvelling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." "Was that not enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you are mad!" he cried aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go and get it and wish," cried the old woman, and dragged him towards the door. He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlour and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish," she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish," repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it shudderingly. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceilings and walls, until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterwards the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but both lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time, screwing up his courage, the husband took the box of matches, and striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy! It's Herbert!" she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go! I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in!" cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son!" she cried, struggling. "Let me go! I'm coming, Herbert! I'm coming!" There was another knock, and another. The old woman with a sudden wrench broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down! I can't reach it!" But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house. and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw, and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp, flickering opposite, shone on a quiet and deserted road.
And once again, ladies and gentlemen, that is The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. For those that have not heard that before, I hope you guys enjoyed that immensely. I know it's, again, another one of my favorites. And it's a cautionary tale, of course, isn't it? Be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. And it just might be not the way you would wish for it to begin with, right? That's kind of the way it works sometimes. And it's interesting because at the end of it, it spoke of the corpse, if you will, in this case, coming back. And that reminds me of another little Halloween song that we used to sing back in school. So this will be the last thing we're going to do before we hit our break and go ahead and take a network break here in just a minute and come back, and we're going to do the second half of where we're going to talk about some more Edgar Allan Poe. We're going to do a little bit more Poe. I'm going to personally read a Poe tale, hopefully. We'll see how that goes. As well as some Halloween facts and some more music, stories, and fun in the second half. But we are not at the break yet, ladies and gentlemen. We've got one more fun little thing we've got to do here. Like I said, that story about the thing coming back reminds me of a song that we used to sing during Halloween season in school called The Cat Came Back.
Now old Mr. Johnson had troubles of his own. He had a yellow cat who wouldn't leave his home. He tried and he tried to give the cat away. He gave it to a man going far, far away. But the cat came back the very next day. The cat came back. They thought he was a goner, but the cat came back. He just couldn't stay away. Give me a meow, go. Now the man around the corner swore he'd kill the cat on sight, so he loaded up his shotgun with nails and dynamite. He waited and he waited for the cat to come around. 97 pieces of the man is all that they found. But you know, the cat came back the very next day. The cat came back. They thought he was a goner, but the cat came back. He just couldn't stay away. Give me a meow, ghost. So he gave it to a man going up in a balloon. He told him for to take it to the man in the moon. The balloon came down about 90 miles away. Where the man is now, well, I dare not say. But you know, the cat came back the very next day. The cat came back. They thought he was a goner, but the cat came back. He just couldn't stay away. Give me a meow, go. So he gave it to a man going way out west. He told him for to take it to the one he loved the best. First the train hit the track, then it jumped a rail. Not a soul was left behind to tell the gruesome tale. But you know what? The cat came back the very next day. The cat came back. They thought he was a goner, but the cat came back. He just couldn't stay away. Give me a meow, goat. Now the cat was the possessor of a family of his own, with 7 little kittens, till there came a cyclone. It tore the houses all apart and tossed the cat around. The air was filled with kittens, but not one was ever found. The cat came back the very next day. The cat came back. They thought he was a goner, but the cat came back. He just couldn't stay away. Give me a meow, go. Sing it all again now. The cat came back the very next day. The cat came back. They thought he was the gunner, but the cat came back. He just couldn't stay away. Give me a meow. Go. Louder meow. Louder. A little quieter. Quieter meow. Quieter now. Quieter.
And that is Harry S. Miller and the Cat Came Back. What a fun little song that is. The darn thing just wouldn't go away no matter what happened. It had 9.5, maybe even 19.5 lives, right? Guys, I hope you've enjoyed the first half of this Halloween party. I know I am having an absolute blast. This Howl-O-Ween Spooktactular. That's right. Everybody, we're going to go ahead and take a network break right here. I know it's a little bit early. We're going to go ahead and get the break out of the way and come back and have a lot more fun, ladies and gentlemen. So you stick right there. We'll be back with the second half of the Halloween party right after these messages. Don't you touch that dial.
We gotta stoke the fires and run off the men in black. Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back.
Sex in the City? Nope. Interview with a vampire? Nope. If you build it, they will come? Febreze? Dweeze in the middle? Wrong again. Depends. Nope. Welcome to the Twilight Zone, my friends. A phenomenon known as the Mandela effect. You may have heard of it. You may want to not neglect. Unbecoming, awake, and spiritually inclined. So sit back, relax, while I blow your mind. Take the thumb off the cell, stop following the sheep. Down the rabbit hole we go. Are you ready for that leap? The Zapruder film, #JFK. I looked at the footage and I said, what the heck? How come there are 6 people in that dang car? Stretch limo, for me, this was all too bizarre. A glass behind the driver, no way, Jose. I remember before in the car, my mind was in total disarray. Trying to make sense of what I was seeing, what I was witnessing. Didn't connect with my inner being. A second woman in the car for me was only the first lady. Do you smell what the rock is cooking? All this seemed kinda shady. Berenstein Bears. Nope. Shazam? Sinbad? Not in this reality. Good lord. An awakening. Was it all a revelation? The naysayers and skeptics call it confabulation. They say we misremembered and call us bat crazy. Did you smoke a doobie? Maybe that's why it's a little bit hazy. Unless you experience it, you'll never know. But enough of that. On with this Mandela effect flow. Mandela effect in the house. What in the world happened to Ed McMahon? In this reality, Publishers Clearinghouse was not a fan. Never the spokesperson, but we remember it clear as day. McMahon holding that check while the winner yelled out, yay! American Family Publishers, never heard of them until now. This Mandela effect has me raising the people's eyebrow. So many theories on what it could be. Have you ever heard of CERN and the LHC? Luke, I am your father. Nope. Sally Fields? Nope, wrong again. That stands for the Large Hadron Collider. I thought I would mention. You know, the machine that opens up portals into different dimensions? You're probably thinking that this is all science fiction, but you gotta think outside the box and have no restrictions. Alternate realities and parallel dimensions. Okay, I get some of your apprehensions. Could this all be a spiritual evolution? Cause the human race has grown tired of this toxic pollution. Mandela effect in the house. Crazy. Some people, they just don't understand. That's just the way it is. You know? Stay strong, my friends. That's just the way it is. Dolly has no braces? Are you serious? Good lord. Joel Osteen. So what the heck happened to the owl? Oh my gosh. Oh, this is definitely the Twilight Zone. This is crazy. Anyhow.
Here's what's crazy. Anyhow is how that song ends.
It just stops with any halfway through howl. Juanito, 1975, with the most famous Mandela effect rap in all of history. Available on YouTube at Juanito 1975. Good evening, everyone. Are you enjoying Jerry Hicks' Howl-O-Ween? I am. If you are, and you haven't done so already, please make sure to thumb up that video, hit that subscribe button, and ring that bell. You'll get our notifications every time we go live. We're here every Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday nights, bringing you the very best of Common Sense Radio, the Rippin' Rabbit Hole. I'll be back again tomorrow night, Friday, October 30th, with a look at the Monster Mash. That's right, he did the mash. He did the Monster Mash. The Monster Mash. It was a graveyard smash. He did the mash. Whatever happened to my Transylvania twist? Find out tomorrow night, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central. I can tell you this. We're going to have a good time. Kind of like I'm going to have fun. You're going to have fun. We're going to all have so much fun. We'll be whistling zippity-doo-dah out of our jack-o'-lanterns Halloween night, October 31st, as Spooktober comes to an end. Halloween, Ghost to Ghost, in a tribute to the late great Art Bell. Our open lines and wild card open for your ghost stories. Oh, it's that spooky time of the year where we light a campfire, perhaps a candle, and tell each other ghost stories. But the fun won't end there. No, no, no. In the backstage VIP lounge, our Rippin' Rabbit Hole Halloween costume party will take place immediately following Saturday night's broadcast in the VIP 24/7 chat lounge, where the conversation continues. Now, you're going to have a costume of some sort, and we will not allow a 3D avatar or a filter of any kind on your camera. You have to have a legitimate costume to truly participate in our end of Spooktober Halloween bash in the backstage VIP chat lounge. It's going to be a lot of fun October 31st, and then rolling into November 1st with a fantastic fun show Sunday night, 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central. Will my life DIY stay seated on the throne as the current fantastic fun king queen, or will perhaps somebody knock her up and take the crown? It's going to be an interesting night. Tune in Sunday night and find out. We now return back to Jerry Hicks and the Darkwolf's Den Howl-O-Ween Spook Extravaganza.
Come in, judge me for my sin. I don't care what anybody say. I'm gonna sit right here, even when the night wind blows on me. I'm on a spiritual journey. The great pumpkin, they know from me. There is nothing to fear. The great every year I say a prayer, most faithful anywhere. Keep the fire burning inside, nothing can make it go out. The moon is full and howling dogs, closing in as roiling fogs, cover up in a misty glow, but I'm not giving up now. It's a
If you were meant to be controlled, you would have come with a remote, but you didn't. And that's why you listen to the Darkwolf's Den Show. Now, here is your host, Jerry Hicks.
That's right, I am Jerry Hicks, and welcome back to the second half of the Darkwolf's Den Show. Whether you're on the edge of reality, the edge of the galaxy, or the edge of your seat, We're glad you chose us to be right there with you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is Spooktober 29th, 2020, and tonight it is our Howl-O-Ween Spookstravaganza. That's right. This is more of a variety show, a little different than what we normally do. We've had stories, we've had songs, and we're going to continue to have both, as well as a couple few facts thrown in here and there. And we're going to carry on this evening with another story from Edgar Allan Poe, one of my absolute favorites, called The Telltale Heart, and is going to be read by yours personally, Jerry Hicks. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degree, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus I'd myself rid myself of the eye forever. Now this to the point. You fancy me mad? Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh so cautiously. Cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it, just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it is impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in the opening of the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph, to think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me. For he moved onto the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently, I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief, oh no! It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I know the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo and the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since that first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is but a mouse crossing the floor. Or it is merely a cricket which has had a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found it all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mouthful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without fearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot out from the crevice and fell upon that vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saved with perfect distinctness, all of blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon that darned eye. And have I not told you what you mistake for madness is over-acuteness of the senses? Now I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder. I say louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous, so I am. And now at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must have burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, that heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eyes would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring in the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too weary for that. A tub had caught all. Ha-ha! When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock. Still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart. For what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been logged at the police office, and they had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officer was satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things, but ere long I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained deafness, until at length I found the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observation of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God! No, they heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear this hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt I must scream or die, and now again, hark! Louder, louder, louder! Villains, I shriek! Disassemble no more! I admit the deed! Tear up the planks! Here! It is the beating of his hideous heart! And that, ladies and gentlemen, is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. I hope everybody enjoyed that reading by yours truly, Jerry Hicks. Ladies and gentlemen, that is only the beginning of the second half of the show. We've got so much more to go. Check this out. We haven't even spoken about Halloween and its actual roots yet, right? And that's where we're gonna get right now.
It's widely believed that Halloween developed from the ancient Celtic harvest festivals, particularly the ancient Irish festival of Samhain. This day marked the end of summer and the harvest and the beginning of the winter, when people believed that the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead was at its thinnest. Scared yet? Nah, me neither. As such, the ancient Celtic peoples would wear costumes and light bonfires to ward off malevolent spirits. Smart. Exactly what I would do if I was an ancient Celt. Luckily, I'm a modern half-Celt, so I just think I'll take it easy instead. However, the Celtic origin of Halloween has been somewhat disputed by certain scholars who claim there is very little evidence, other than the timing of the festivals, to associate the modern celebration of Halloween with Samhain specifically. Indeed, numerous end-of-summer festivals were observed in ancient northern Europe, and it's hard to know exactly how the illiterate pagans of these lands celebrated them because they were, well, illiterate and didn't write anything down. Remember kids, always leave a note. Regardless, something spooky was going on back in ancient northern Europe. Around this time of year, tribes located across France and Germany traditionally wore costumes of animal heads and skins to connect to spirits of the dead. Revelers also dressed as evil spirits simply by blackening their faces. Eventually, these pagan celebrations were assimilated into the Christian calendar. In the mid-8th century, Pope Gregory III moved the date of All Saints' Day, the Christian festival celebrated in honour of all the saints, from the 13th of May to the 1st of November, coinciding with several pagan holidays that fell on or around this time, including Samhain. All Saints' Day, also known as All Hallows' Day, hello there, is the second day in the three-day celebration of All Hallow Tide, the first being All Hallows' Eve and the third All Souls' Day. This period was dedicated to remembering the dead, including saints, also known as Hallows, martyrs, and all the faithful Christians who have died. As such, All Hallows' Eve falls on the same day as Samhain, and the rest is literally history.
So as we see, the Pope decided to just put the holiday near the pagan holidays. That way they would have no choice but to be celebrating with the Christians, right? It's kind of a dirty, underhanded way to do it, but it worked, and it's crazy how it's grown into what it is today, or what it used to be in modern times anyway, and we'll get into more of that in just a second.
Bats in particular are associated with Halloween because of the ancient Samhain ritual of lighting special bonfires, attracting insects which in turn would attract bats, hoping to bag themselves a delicious, savoury moth.
Not to count the fact that bats are just creepy and some of them actually drink human blood, but besides that, you know, they're not too bad, right? And you remember our fact of the day today had to do with the first witch trial in France, but where did the word witch actually come from?
The word witch comes from the Old English wick, meaning wise woman. According to certain legends, witches gathered only twice a year when the seasons changed. The first meeting was held on the eve of May Day on the 30th of April,
which interestingly enough also happens to be my birthday, the 13th of April.
And the other was Halloween.
And you guys know another motif that is really common around the Halloween season, and you always see it on our thumbnails there, is that full moon. But it's really special when you get a full moon on Halloween, right?
Although full moons are often associated with Halloween, full moons on Halloween are actually fairly rare, with the most recent Halloween full moons occurring in 1955, 1974 and 2001. However, a Halloween full moon is expected to occur relatively soon, by the time I'm standing in this booth, in the year 2020.
That's right, guys. If 2020 wasn't already especially rare and crazy enough as it is, Halloween night we will have a full moon. Oh, yeah. That's what I gotta say about that.
Trick-or-treating is possibly the most popular Halloween custom, in which children dress up in scary or amusing costumes and go door to door to ask for sweets or candy.
Does anybody know where trick-or-treating actually got its origins from? It actually may not be how you think it started.
Most experts trace trick-or-treating back to the medieval Christian practice of souling, when children and the poor would go around a community offering prayers for the dead in exchange for a special small round cake called soul cakes.
And I have actually looked up what soul cakes are, and they are traditionally a cross between a scone and a biscuit, lightly spiced and filled with currants or raisins. So there you go. They used to beg for these soul cakes in exchange for prayers for the dead, or the poor would go around as well as the children and do this and beg for soul cakes or beg for food in exchange for prayer.
The first known mention of the term trick-or-treating in print in North America occurred in 1927 in Blackie, a small town in Alberta, Canada.
Now that I did not realize. I didn't know that the term trick-or-treat was actually a fairly newer term, only being really coined in 1927. But you know, when you are out trick-or-treating and you're running around and you're going house to house, one of the first things you see as you walk up each walkway is what? A jack-o'-lantern, right? A pumpkin carved with a crazy face on it, right?
Another popular Halloween pastime is carving pumpkins into jack-o'-lanterns, another practice that can be traced all the way back to the invented ancient Irish. To make jack-o'-lanterns, large pumpkins are hollowed out and scary, devilish faces are carved onto their surface. Often a candle is placed inside to illuminate the creepy face in the dark.
What you may find really, really fascinating is something that I know I found really fascinating was the story of the jack-o'-lantern. Now, check this out, guys. This is the original creation story of Jack-o'-lantern.
The term jack-o'-lantern comes from a tale in Irish folklore about a man named Stingy Jack. There are many different versions of the tale, but the most common telling has Jack out one night getting absolutely trashed with a devil, never a good move, who had heard of Jack's reputation for being a liar and manipulator. When it came time to pay, Jack convinced his drinking partner to transform into a coin, so he could pay for the drinks without spending money. At this point, Jack placed the devil coin into a pocket which also contained a silver cross, preventing him from transforming back into his natural form until he had agreed to not bother Jack for 10 years, during which time the devil could never claim his soul.
Which, I gotta say, so far, that's a pretty slick move. I like that. He's tricked the devil. How often do you hear stories of tricking the devil? You always hear the story of the devil tricking humans, but how often do you hear a story about a human tricking a devil? But wait, that's only the beginning of the story.
I bet you're wondering how this translates to pumpkins. Well, wait for it. 10 years later, the devil returned to finally claim Jack's soul, probably not particularly happy about having been tricked into becoming loose change. Jack seemingly relented, asking for only one thing before his death, a piece of fruit from a tree to sate his hunger. Seeing no reason to acquiesce to this request, despite having been embarrassingly tricked by the same man 10 years previously, the devil climbed to the top of the tree to retrieve said fruit. At this point, Jack then carved a cross into the bark, preventing the devil from descending until he agreed to give Jack another decade of devil-free life. Why didn't he just ask for a whole life of devil-free? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Jack died soon after making this second deal, at which point God refused him entry into heaven on account of the sinful life he had led. Not to mention the several deals he made with the devil, who was like God's biggest hater. Fulfilling his promise to Jack, the devil could also not claim his soul, and Jack was forced to roam the earth forever, with only an illuminated turnip to light his way.
It seems the original jack-o'-lantern was not a pumpkin, but in fact a turnip.
Based on this legend, people would carve scary demonic faces into root vegetables like turnips and potatoes to scare away Stingy Jack or any other spirits of the night.
So how did that translate into pumpkins then?
Jack-o'-lanterns eventually made their transition into the larger, more familiar pumpkin when the Irish brought the tradition to America, where pumpkins were used because they were cheaper and more abundant. Also, everything has to be bigger in America, apparently. This mixes the European tradition of Halloween with the New World, as pumpkins are actually indigenous to the Americas, having originated in Mexico between 5,000 and 7,500 years ago.
Now, once again, I have learned yet another fact. I did not know that the pumpkin originated in Mexico so long ago. That is very interesting, too. So it's been with us a long, long time. And speaking of older things, the older traditions that are bygone and just not practiced no more are really interesting. The quote superstitious traditions end quote of Halloween. Like, check this one out.
For a time, there was a popular superstition in Scotland that if a young girl looked into a mirror while walking downstairs at midnight on Halloween, lots of conditions there, she would be able to see the face of her future boyfriend. Also, sounds like a great way to end up in A&E because you fell down the stairs, you morons.
Yes, you might want to be very careful as not to fall down the stairs while trying to fulfill all these many different conditions.
Another Halloween tradition comes from 18th century Ireland, which involved hiding a ring and a thimble in fruit bread called barmbrack, or in a bowl of mashed potatoes and cabbage, known as cold cannon. Whoever found the ring was sure to find true love, whereas the person who found the thimble would remain unbetrothed for the coming year, and probably stinking of mashed potato and cabbage.
And this is one of many older traditions and superstitions that I had never heard of before.
Number 43. Another tradition states that if a person wears his or her clothes inside out and walks backwards on the night of Halloween, he or she will see a witch at midnight. Again, another great way to end up in the emergency room on Halloween, because you were walking backwards while hunting for witches.
That one kind of reminds me of that 90s craze with crisscross and wearing the clothes backwards, right?
In some parts of Ireland, people celebrated Halloween by playing romantic fortune-telling games.
All right, girls, some of these are for you. Check these out. I think some of these are kind of funny myself.
As Halloween was one of the main celebrations of the year where young people could mingle with the opposite sex. For instance, apple bobbing was used to predict future romances. Young women would mark a particular apple, and if a young gentleman managed to capture it, they were a match.
Wow, now that really raises the stakes of apple bobbing, doesn't it?
Another matchmaking tradition had young women peel an apple on Halloween before throwing the peel over her shoulder. If the peel appeared to form a letter when it landed, that would indicate the initial of the girl's future spouse.
I have two problems with this. Number one, it depends on how you peel the apple. But even if you do peel it in just a regular spiral, you're only going to get so many letters, right? Like what, a C and maybe a J or an L, if you're lucky. And if it lands right, it might split into a secondary bunch of stuff that might look like a letter. But, I mean, really, you're kind of limited on what you're going to get out of this apple peel, right?
On Halloween night 1992, the BBC aired a reality horror mockumentary TV film called Ghost Watch, presented by legendary broadcaster and journalist Michael Parkinson as a live investigation into the most haunted house in Britain, the inhabitants of which were apparently being terrorised by a ghost called Pipes. Despite being billed as a fictional supernatural drama in the Radio Times, not everybody read the Radio Times, so thousands of people across the country assumed it was real and had the absolute living daylights scared out of them.
Which I'm sure some of you right now are thinking it probably reminds you of the War of the Worlds scare that we had here in America. And I would agree, I think that's absolutely hilarious. But guys, that's all the facts we have about Halloween this evening. And we're going to move on back into some stories and songs and try to fun things up just a little bit more here, guys. Not that we aren't having a blast, because I gotta say, I'm having an absolute ball tonight. But let's get one more song here. You guys know there's actually a kind of a sweet, romantic Halloween song? Yeah, I know, right? A romantic Halloween song? Check this out. Would you be my Halloween pumpkin? It's probably the worst and cheesiest pickup line I think I've ever used and or heard. But anyway, moving along, ladies and gentlemen. we're gonna move on to yet another Halloween short story. This is one that was suggested to me, actually. I really wasn't as big on this one, but this is one that you guys may know. This is yet another Edgar Allan Poe. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you The Black Cat.
The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. For the most wild yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I am not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburthen my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little but horror. To many they will seem less terrible than barocks. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive, in the circumstances I detail with awe, nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy, I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for the faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. I married early, and was happy to find my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mention the matter at all for no better reason than that it happens just now to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favourite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend interference, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when by accident or through affection they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, for that disease is like alcohol, and at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old, and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, when in his fright at my violence he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fibre in my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut out one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment of half horror, half of remorse for the crime for which I had been guilty. But it was at best a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left, as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of the creature which had once loved me so. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit philosophy takes no account, yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man, who was at times a vile or silly action, for no other reason than because he knows he should not. Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree, hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes and with the bitterest remorse at my heart, hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason of offence, hung it because I knew that in doing so I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. On the night of the day on which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames, the whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of events and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had here, in great measure, resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to its having been recently spread. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with very minute and eager attention. The words strange, singular, and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas-relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvellous. There was a rope about the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my wonder and my terror were extreme. But at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd. by someone of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. The falling off other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did not the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back to my spirit a half-sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look about me among the vile haunts, which I now habitually frequented, for another pet of the same species and of somewhat similar appearance, with which to supply its place. One night as I sat half stupefied in my den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object, reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin, or of rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his whole body, but this cat had a large although indefinite splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of the breast. Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it off the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When I reached the house, it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favourite of my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was, its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature. A certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty prevented me from physically abusing it. I did not for some weeks strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence, as from the breath of a pestilence. What added no doubt to my hatred of the beast was the discovery on the morning after I brought it home that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed in much higher degree that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, in its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinacity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caressing. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or, fastening its long sharp claws in my dress, clamber in this manner to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from doing so, partially by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell I am almost ashamed to own, that the horror and terror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair, of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had originally been indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and for which a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had at length assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a hideous, of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. Oh, mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime and agony of death. And now I was indeed wretched, beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast, whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed. A brute beast to work out for me a man fashioned in the image of the high God, so much of insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things, and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury for which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me upon some household errand, into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife, goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal. I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith and my entire deliberation to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbours. Many projects entered my mind. At one period, I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again, I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box as if merchandise, with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cell was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection caused by a false chimney, or fireplace, that had been filled up and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. In this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position while, with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this, I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here at last, then, my labour has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it at the moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate, but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger, and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the deep and blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus for one night at least since its introduction into my house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and third day had passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a freeman. The monster in terror had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the 4th day of the assassination, a party of police came, very unexpectedly, into my house, and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatsoever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the 3rd or 4th time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say if but one word by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house. I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls... Are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together." And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with the cane with which I held in my hand upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, a cry, at first muffled and broken, like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony and out of the demons that exult in the damnation. Of my own thoughts it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the party upon the stairs remained motionless, through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb.
And that is, of course, The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. And keeping along this animal theme, just one last quick poem, Halloween poem, if you will. A lot of us have heard of the spider and the fly, but how many have actually heard the spider and the fly?
The spider and the fly. "Will you walk into my parlour?" said the spider to the fly. "'Tis the prettiest little parlour that ever you did spy. The way into my parlour is up a winding stair, and I have many curious things to show you when you are there." "Oh, no, no," said the little fly, "to ask me is in vain, for who goes up your winding stair can ne'er come down again. I'm sure you must be weary, dear, with soaring up so high. Will you rest upon my little bed? Said the spider to the fly. There are pretty curtains drawn around. The sheets are fine and thin. And if you like to rest a while, I'll snugly tuck you in. No, said the little fly, for I've often heard it said, they never, never wake again who sleep upon your bed. Said the cunning spider to the fly, dear friend, what can I do to prove the warm affection I've always felt for you? I have within my pantry good store of all that's nice. I'm sure you're very welcome. Will you please to take a slice? Oh, no, no, said the little fly. Kind sir, that cannot be. I've heard what's in your pantry, and I do not wish to see. Sweet creature, said the spider, you're witty and you're wise. How handsome are your gauzy wings, how brilliant are your eyes. I have a little looking glass upon my parlor shelf. If you'd step in one moment, dear, you shall behold yourself. I thank you, gentle sir, she said, for what you're pleased to say. And bidding you good morning now, I'll call another day. The spider turned him round about and went into his den. For well he knew the silly fly would soon come back again. So he wove a subtle web in a little corner sly and set his table ready to dine upon the flies. Then he came out to his door again, and merrily did sing, come hither, hither, pretty fly, with a pearl and silver wing. Your robes are green and purple, there's a crest upon your head. Your eyes are like the diamond bright, but mine are dull as lead. Alas, alas, how very soon this silly little fly, hearing his wily, flattering words, came slowly flitting by. With buzzing wings she hung aloft, then near and nearer drew, thinking only of her brilliant eyes and green and purple hue, thinking only of her crested head, poor foolish thing. At last, up jumped the cunning spider and fiercely held her fast. He dragged her up his winding stair into his dismal den, within his little parlour, but she ne'er came out again. And now, dear little children, who may this story read, to idle, silly, flattering words, I pray you ne'er give heed. Unto an evil counsellor, close heart and ear and eye, and take a lesson from this tale of the spider and the fly.
And ladies and gentlemen, after all the stories, all the songs, all the fun, all the episodes we've had this month, it all boils down to saying one thing. Even in 2020, we can celebrate and have a good time on Halloween.
Can you see? It's just me. I'm dressed up to look like a skeleton. A skeleton. I. Oh, I'm gonna scare you now.
Happy Halloween, everybody.
Can you see? It's just me. I'm dressed up to look like a vampire. A vampire. I. I'm gonna scare you now.
Happy Halloween, guys.
Can you see? It's just me. I'm dressed up to look like a ghost. A ghost. I. I'm gonna scare you now.
that's it for the DarkWolf's Den Show for Spooktober 29th, 2020 in the Howl-O-Ween Spooktactular. I hope everybody has enjoyed this amazing episode and the closeout of the DarkWolf's Den Show for Spooktober 2020. It has been an amazing ride, ladies and gentlemen. This month, the Dark Wolf has gotten the host, I've gotten a host, and we've gotten to have a lot of fun. Ladies and gentlemen, the den may be closing this evening, but don't you worry. The weekend fun has only just begun, that's right. Make sure you come back tomorrow night for AJ the Rippin' Rabbit's Rippin' Rabbit Hole live show, where he's going to be talking about the Monster Mash. And from what I hear, it's going to be a graveyard smash, that's right. Then on Saturday night, he's going to do a classic Art Bell Coast to Coast, that's right. Get your ghost stories ready. Hopefully you've thought of a couple in the last couple of weeks. Get your ghost stories ready to call in and share live on the air with AJ the Rippin' Rabbit as he does Ghost to Ghost, an Art Bell classic. I wish I was able to join him for that show, ladies and gentlemen. I personally have another thing that I must be doing at that time, but I will be catching the replay. I assure you, I look forward to hearing everybody's ghost stories. Then on Sunday, he's going to close the weekend out with the most amazing fun you can have on radio. That's right, it is the Fantastic Fun Show. Is My Life DIY going to be able to hold on to her crown, or will somebody be able to dethrone her? Who knows, we may have an old school player back in the game. You never know what happens on the Fantastic Fun Show coming up this Sunday, November 1st, 2020. And that will close out the weekend here on Rippin' Common Sense Radio. And remember, every show starts at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central here at Rippin' Common Sense Radio Network. And we really appreciate every last one of you coming by and hanging out with us every last week. You guys really do help make this show what it is and this network what it is. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm about to go over to my favorite haunt. That is the RippinRabbitHole.com. That is RippinRabbitHole.com. That's right. Over there you're going to find the 24/7 Backstage Lounge. Select that page, scroll about halfway down that page, and you're going to find the VIP entrance. And that is where you're going to find me and the rest of the team and the crew that hangs out back there from around the world. Because for you guys, the conversation may be over, but for the Rippin' Rabbits, the conversation has just begun. And we'd love for you to come back there and continue the fun party conversation in this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jerry Hicks, and on behalf of Walt House, Michael Musco, Chick Mandela Effect, and AJ the Rippin' Rabbit, and everybody at Rippin' Common Sense Radio, we thank you for being here with us this evening. And remember always, stay awake, but dare to dream. Happy Halloween, everybody.
Oh yeah, that's right. Give yourselves a round of applause. You ended another Thursday night right here on the very best of Common Sense Radio, the Rippin' Rabbit Hole. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation of the DarkWolf's Den Howl-O-Ween Spookstravaganza, and you haven't done so already, please make sure to thumb up that video, hit that subscribe button, and ring that bell. You'll get our notifications every time we go live. I'll be back again tomorrow night, Friday, October 30th, with a look at the Monster Mash. It led the Billboard Hot 100 at the peak position of number 1 in 1962. That's right. I'm talking about the mad scientist who narrates the famous Boris Pickett song, The Monster Mash. He did the mash. He did the Monster Mash. Whatever happened to my Transylvania twist? Find out tomorrow night as we explore a Monster Mash rabbit hole together. Then, believe it or not, Howl-O-Ween, October 31st, Saturday night, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific, in a tribute to the late, great Art Bell, Ghost to Ghost. We're going to open up the wild card line, allow you to call in live, on air, your ghost stories. Get them ready, folks. I can't wait to hear them. I'm so excited. I love Halloween. After Ghost to Ghost, join us in the VIP 24/7 chat lounge as we end Spooktober together in a VIP chat lounge costume party. You have to come in costume. It's going to be a lot of fun. I can't wait. And then November 1st on Sunday, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10/9 Central. Join us for our November installation of the Fantastic Fun Show interactive game night, family fun. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your family's friends. Will My Life DIY stay seated on the throne? Or perhaps will somebody else be claimed the Fantastic Fun King or Queen? We're going to find out before the weekend is over. I look forward to spending tomorrow night with you. So, wherever you are, good morning, good evening, or good day. On behalf of Jerry Hicks and the DarkWolf's Den Show, I'm AJ, the Rippin' Rabbit. Until we meet again, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.
Manifestation or a dark delusion? Is this real or just illusion? I'm lost in a wonderland of confusion.
experience this too? Well,